Hi, my name is Rowan Cantor. I teach world literature in the English department at Stanford. I am here to do a wonderful introduction of, for me, a thrilling event based on the research of one of our senior thesis writers, Karunya Bhramasandra. Before I do that, I am going to read the land acknowledgement. We recognize that Stanford is an occupier of the ancestral and unceded land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. We are grateful to be guests on this land and commit to solidarity to Indigenous struggles. I noticed the wording of this has changed recently to be a little bit more powerful. And now I think we have to think a little bit about how our actions can follow up the more direct and powerful wording of this land acknowledgement. But with that out of the way, my job today is to introduce Karunya and talk a little bit about how she came to this project and to this, for me, really, really exciting group of speakers that are going to be doing the Q&A with us tonight. So Karunya came in as a freshman, I think, to my class on the Indian novel. And she was so excited to be there. She was keeping up with it, what was in effect an advanced class. She was the only freshman in the class, and we kept in touch after that. And essentially what Karunya did is she brought together all of these different disciplines and structures to try and think not only about South Asian literature as it is being written in South Asia, but increasingly in terms of something we might call South Asian American literature, although Karunya can also tell you why that is sometimes an insufficient term or not the term that we would choose. And so I was thrilled when Karunya came to me as a rising senior and said, you know what I'd really like to do is write about South Asian American literature, but specifically about South Asian young adult literature being written in the US. And what is so exciting to me about this project is that it actually shows a kind of gap in the traditional formation of an English department. That is, unfortunately for us, English professors tend to get interested in things that are not really interesting to the majority of readers who read the majority of literature. One of these things that the majority of readers read is young adult literature. Young adult literature is increasingly important as a generic category for the people who are coming into our majors, and yet we have almost no scholarship. Certainly I was not an expert prior to this project in the formation of young adult literature. I certainly still am not, but I am so excited to have been invited in a sense to be a reader of South Asian American young adult literature. And I'm going to let Karunya explain a little bit more to you why this flourishing and sort of like rising field, I would say, is a really fascinating space to explore and a really, really important and politically rich space to think with. So Karunya, I'll turn it over to you.
Hey, hello everyone. Good evening, and thank you so much, Rowan, for that lovely introduction. My name is Karunya. I am delighted to be moderating this panel with some really excellent authors that I deeply admire. And before we jump into the series of questions that I've prepared to help us investigate a little bit more of what we mean when we say South Asian young adult literature, I'm just going to introduce all of our speakers briefly, starting with Tanya Batejo. Tanya Batejo is an English teacher and a writer living on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, Vancouver, Canada. She completed her English and education degrees at the University of British Columbia, then spent time in New York attaining her Master of Arts through Columbia University's Teacher College. Most recently, Tanya received a creative writing certificate through Simon Fraser University's Writers Studio. Her writing life has mostly consisted of teaching writing in Vancouver, where she has continually been inspired by the brilliant young people in her midst. In both teaching and writing, she is committed to positive, diverse representation. Our next speaker is Rajani LaRocca, who was born in India, raised in Kentucky, and now lives in the Boston area, where she practices medicine and writes award-winning books for young readers, including the Newbery Honor-winning middle grade novel In Verse, Red, White, and Whole, which is one of the novels I studied for my senior thesis. She's always been an omnivorous reader, and now she is an omnivorous writer of fiction and nonfiction, novels and picture books, prose and poetry. She finds inspiration in her family, her childhood, the natural world, math, science, and just about everywhere she looks. Our next speaker is Syed Masood, who grew up in Karachi, Pakistan, and currently lives in Sacramento, California, but there have been plenty of stops in between. He is a first-generation immigrant twice over. He has been a citizen of 3 different countries and lived in 9 cities. He is, as Goethe said, nothing but a wanderer on this earth. Living among different people in different countries at fascinating times in their histories has shaped both his view of the world and his writing. Ultimately, human beings are the same everywhere, despite the fact that they tell themselves everywhere that they are different from each other. And the theme of this fundamental human unity informs everything he writes. Our fourth speaker is Sajni Patel, an award-winning author of women's fiction young adult books, drawing on her experiences growing up in Texas, an inexplicable knack for romance and comedy, and the recently resurfaced dark side of fantastical things. Her works have appeared on numerous Best of the Year and must-read lists from Cosmo, Oprah Magazine, Teen Vogue, Apple Books, Audiophile, Tribeza, Austin Women's Magazine, NBC, The Insider, Pop Sugar, BuzzFeed, and many others. Our last speaker is Anuradha Rajurkar, who is the national recipient of the SCBWI Emerging Voices Award for her contemporary debut novel, American Vidya. Born and raised in the Chicago area to Indian immigrant parents, Anuradha earned 2 degrees from Northwestern University, and for many years had the joy of being a public school teacher by day, writer by night. She hopes her stories will inspire teens to embrace their unique identities and inner badass despite outside pressures and cultural expectations. So we have some very impressive, very qualified artists here with us today, and I think we should just jump straight into some questions I would love to hear all of your takes on. So firstly, we call this event Young Adult Literature, a conversation with South Asian authors. And I want to get a clearer picture of that label, young adult. So why YA? What is the power of YA according to all of you? What are you as creators trying to say, and why is YA the medium for it? Additionally, what do you believe are, if any, the limitations of YA as a genre? So how we're going to do this, I'm just going to call on you guys as if I was a professor, and I would love if you could give your answers. So let's start with Tanya.
Thank you. Thanks for holding this, Karunya. This is such an amazing event. I think it's the first all South Asian panel I've been on. So I'm really happy to be here and meet everybody and be part of the conversation. So I came through to YA writing through teaching, really. It was a natural progression for me from teaching writing, teaching English to high school students, and getting to know teenagers, spending more than half of my life with teenagers for the past 20 years, and then being really committed to making spaces at my school for students who maybe didn't fit or who didn't feel like there was a place for them. And so when I started writing books, I don't know that I set out to write YA, but it made a lot of sense. The story I started telling felt like it was the story that should be shared with young people. It felt like the story that I wanted to read when I was, or what I probably should have been reading or could have been reading, or would have really appreciated as a young person myself. And so just the sheer, experience of being around young people, seeing their struggles, seeing their extraordinary, selves, I think lent itself to me wanting to write for them and hopefully make that really difficult time of being a teenager a little bit easier, which I think is what YA offers a lot of young people.
Yeah, I completely agree. Sajni, do you have anything to add to that?
Unmute. I also didn't intend to write YA. It was just writing stories because for me, the story always comes first. But the topics of the story and a lot of the times the voice of the story showed me that this story is intended to be YA. So I just started writing YA. And then as I was writing YA, I began to be more focused on the things that the messages that I was trying to send. And a lot like the rest of us, I wanted to see myself in the books. And growing up, I didn't have those kind of books. And so straddling different cultures and in the South, I often found myself being lost. So writing YA books for me is like a way of showing myself like how things could have been, or helping other kids to learn to embrace themselves, embrace their identities, and not just run away or dislike what they are because it's different in the world. And so I receive a lot of messages saying that my books have helped teens, and also that teens can see themselves, and a lot of messages, to my surprise, which are really heartfelt, teens are coming and saying that they see themselves so much and have cried or have found ways to deal with things and move on, or to open discussions about topics that are very difficult in their family or in their community. And yeah, just writing YA has just opened up so many avenues for me, and to be able to connect to my former self, but also to connect readers to who they are or could be.
I love that. Syed, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I came to YA because I had just finished writing my novel for adults, The Bad Muslim Discount, and I needed sort of a palate cleanser from the bit of darkness that is in that book. And I think YA literature is appealing because it is the literature of hope. I always say adult literature is the literature of discontent. It's about characters who find themselves in a place in their life and they're unhappy with either how they got there or who they are now that they find themselves where they are. Whereas YA literature is a literature of beginnings, of new things. And so it's a literature of hope. And so that's what I found attractive about it. Having written both for adults and for YA, I will say the feel is very different. They're very different types of literature. There are things I do in an adult novel that I can't do in YA. And vice versa. But for example, in Bad Muslim, there's this whole page, which is just allusions and references to literature and religion and symbolism. And I don't explain any of it. And my editor actually contacted me and said, what are you talking about? Can you tell me what these are? And I'm like, well, no, I don't want to tell anybody. And he's like, well, you have to tell me. So, but in YA, you wouldn't do that. You would have to be more inviting and be a better host, I feel like, is a charge of a YA author more so than someone writing for adults. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Rajani, what is your take?
So I find that adolescence is that fascinating time period when we as people are learning so much about ourselves, about our places in our families, our places among our friends, and our places in the world, and how we yearn to address big problems, even though we may not be very powerful yet. I also think that pretty universally, adolescence is the time where we really want to be like everyone else, but we really also need to be ourselves. And I think that intersection is very interesting to me. And if you take that and you add in being an immigrant or being the child of immigrants, it amplifies everything. So I think that I just really love writing about adolescence and for adolescents. And the other thing as adults that we sometimes forget is that young people are not pre-people. They're already people, like they're fully, formed human beings with all kinds of thoughts and feelings. And it's really an honor to be able to address those kinds of thoughts and feelings in what I write. I grew up in an era where there really was no literature for adolescents. We went right from kids' books to adult books. And there's a big space in between that we need to fill. And I agree with my other panelists saying that, this is the literature of hope, because I really do think that seeing things for the first time, experiencing things for the first time is such a beautiful part of life. Like the first time that you fall in love or even have a crush or something, is such an exciting, wonderful time. And we never forget that, right? As adults, we still never forget that. So wow, how exciting to be able to bottle that and put that into a book.
Yeah, I love that. And last but not least, Anuradha. Oh, Anuradha, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I love that everything that everyone said. I feel like YA explores, like Rajani just said, just such a meaningful period of time in our lives. A time when your neurons are firing, our sense of identity and place in the world is under, such construction, I guess. Its power as a genre has joyfully in recent years included a really wide diversity of writers and women and people of color. And I feel like some of the issues that YA is tackling that were once considered, I don't know, maybe too subversive or even taboo, issues relating to like sexuality or gender identity, race, even like the impact of colonialism and the white gaze on our developing sense of self. I mean, these are things that are sort of very forthright in YA, and that's inspiring. In writing my debut, I had hoped to kind of explore that push and pull between immigrant family values, cultural identity, first love, sexuality, even fetishization and bias and prejudice that appear in places that we don't necessarily expect them to appear. And I feel like that's all very much a part of that YA stage, where you don't necessarily see some of the red flags. You don't have the life experience to know that, oh, wow, that's a red flag. And so I love that about it for the story that I was trying to tell with my debut. Limitations, I don't know that I would really call it a limitation, but I just feel like there's in terms of limitations of YA, I would say there's just that unspoken sense, like everybody talked about, that hope is a really important, part of YA, and it's unflinching and its ability to sort of delve deep down into some of the really challenging current topics that we're all facing, while also offering options, for love and hope and light and joy, and being able to sort of present the gamut of the human condition, I guess, is what makes it so impactful as a genre.
Yeah, I love that. I really love how so many of you emphasized hope. I think that's a very powerful factor to consider when you're writing in this genre. And many of you also mentioned like wanting to be seen in novels. And I'm curious when it comes to using that phrase, like feeling seen in something. I would love to know more about what the word representation means to you as creators. And do you think of it as like a useful imperative or mindset for creators of color and or diasporic creators in particular to have when they are writing books, especially for young audiences? And to start off, I'd love to hear from Rajani.
Ooh, this is such a great question. So, as someone who grew up in the United States as the child of immigrants, as an immigrant myself, and who was an avid book lover, like from day one, I read kind of everything I get my hands on. And I read about all kinds of people from all kinds of places and, empathized with them all. And then I went to India and I read books there and empathized with those characters as well. But I never saw my own experience reflected in a book until I was an adult. And I have to tell you, I didn't realize what I was missing until that happened. And it was mind-blowing and like world-changing and earth-shattering, all the giant, all the hyperbole you can throw out there. It was the truth. And I think that because of that experience, when you see yourself, when you see your own experience, it doesn't have to be exactly your experience, but when you do see that finally, you realize that your stories are worthy of being in books. And that, I don't think I realized that I hadn't thought that until that moment. And so I really do believe that everybody deserves to see their own experience reflected in books, and that everybody should read outside their own experience. So I think that representation to me means that authors put their own lived experience or aspects of their own lived experience into the books that they write, to be as authentic as possible. And the really cool thing, I mean, we're a bunch of South Asian authors, right? None of our experiences are the same. So how cool is that? I think that's the other thing that I think representation means to me, is that people from similar backgrounds have different experiences, and that we have an infinite number of stories to tell. And that's just so exciting and wonderful to me.
Yeah, I love that. Syed, can I have your take on this?
So I go back and forth on representation. And I think the reason why is because I've started using words like visibility more. I like the word authentic, like Rajani used. And I think the reason for that is this. The word representation is a progressive idea that's now becoming a regressive force in fiction. And I feel like, and I especially see this because I do write books that deal with religion too sometimes. And so I see a lot of, you're supposed to teach people about your culture. You're supposed to teach and educate people about these things, where I'm not necessarily always convinced that's the purpose of art. The first purpose of art to me is to entertain people and to hold the attention of the audience, right? So when representation, the question becomes, is this good representation? Is it bad representation? And those kind of questions I feel like are problematic. And I think it's a word that needs to be treated with respect and nuance. And so I really like Rajni's definition of it, sort of acknowledging that within the same identity, you can have a variety of different experiences, and one of the things about being a novelist is you write novels about very specific people and very specific circumstances, and those don't always reflect people's lives. I mean, I heard someone say, oh, this representation is bad because this kind of thing never happened to me. And I'm like, well, no one's writing a story about your life. So, and there's a reason for that. So anyway, I'll let the others jump in, but I think it's a useful term. I think it just deserves and needs some nuance. That's all.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Anuradha, I'd love to hear from you on this.
Yeah, I mean, the concept of representation is so complex when it comes to creators of color and diasporic creators in particular, due to the fact that there's just such immense diversity in the South Asian experience. As we've been talking about, it's, we're not a monolith. South Asian identity is so, influenced by the many regions and backgrounds that we draw from, and looks different from person to person, region to region, coast to coast. Some of us draw from influences not only from South Asia and America, but obviously, other countries as well. And happily, as more and more of our stories are being published, this wide diversity will be reflected in the books. And in this way, I feel like representation can be a misnomer, in that it has that potential to sort of box us in. This is what South Asian identity looks like. And, I do believe that over time, the stories that we're telling are going to reveal the South Asian culture being textured and varied, and making the concept of a single story really an antiquated one. I mean, it's I feel like we're moving in that direction, and I try to focus myself on like writing the kinds of stories I, as everyone has talked about, I wish I had when I was younger, and just focus there, rather than how is everybody going to feel about, me writing this? It's like you can kind of, that's a very, you can really talk yourself out of almost any story or any character that you're dreaming up if you're going to kind of go there. So you want to I always try to sort of transcend some of the common tropes that typically are associated with these, South Asian storylines and characters, or the kinds of storylines or characters that people have maybe come to expect on some level, and try to focus in my writing on the kinds of stories that would have made me feel seen. Like, we've talked about visibility, rather than worrying about whether or not I'm representing, the entire community, which is not only daunting, but, impossible.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Sajni, I'd love your take on this as well.
So growing up, I was a pretty avid reader, and I was reading things like Stephen King and basically books written by white men. It never dawned on me throughout school that I was just reading books about white people, particularly like white men, because that was the force behind fantasy and sci-fi and horror, which is what I was really into. Until probably in my 20s, when I saw movements like we need diverse books and own voices and things like that. So I decided to write books based on my experience. And I do get those comments that say, well, this isn't my experience. So this is totally tropey or cliche or bad representation, whatever. But, dismissing the fact that it's my experience, I just write what I know at this point. And when I published my debut, The Trouble with Hating You, back in 2020, that was like my first brown book. Before that, I was just writing the defaults, which was white characters, and I didn't realize that for a long time. And so when my debut came out, I was just so worried and concerned about how the South Asian community, South Asian readers would take my book. Were they going to be offended? Because that book touches on sexual assaults and how the rape culture and things like that are taken in the community and not really addressed, at least in some communities. Of course, we're not a monolith. Again, these things are vastly different among different areas. So I was just so worried and concerned about what people were going to say. Were they going to be mad at me or what? And it was just so much stress. And up until recently, I just pour over every word because I don't want to offend someone. I don't want anything that I write to come across as bad representation. And it is so stressful. And I know for a fact, by discussing these things with other authors, that we as authors of color are kind of pushed into these corners to say you have to represent appropriately, you have to bring the positive into your story instead of just writing a story. Like, I just want to write a story. And I just, yeah, I don't also just don't want to be pigeonholed into writing cultural books. That's what I've written so far, but I'm done with that. You know, I wrote what I wanted to write, and now I'm going to move on to other things. And I just want to write the story. So this is a great conversation, important conversation, because I don't know about everyone else, but I feel the stress of it all because I'm a South Asian writer, and it's just not that way for everyone. It shouldn't be that way for us. We shouldn't have so much on our shoulders. But on the other hand, when I read my messages, because I do read my DMs and website messages and comments, to know that someone saw themselves in the book because they were going through, you know, sexual assault, or they didn't know how to bring up mental health, or whatever the issue is, that makes it worthwhile for me, even though I don't want the stress of being cornered. I do love that my book has reached someone. And when they say they feel seen, they mean that they're not isolated. Like, they have a story of something that happened to them that's very similar, and they're not the only person that's going through it. And now they know how to move through those things. And so that's always very special for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And lastly, Tanya, I'd love for you to share.
Yeah, I don't like going last after all of these really great answers. So many things that, you know, are constantly bouncing around my brain too, as a writer and a reader and a teacher too, around representation. You know, I don't want to repeat what some people have said, but that piece around the more stories, the better, you know, like we need this critical mass of stories so that representation isn't a thing really. It's only a thing because we don't have it. So I feel that strongly is like the more the better. And then the other piece that I just want to add on to everything that everybody's said is that it's still, even though it's fraught, and even though there are these stressors, and you know, there are the positives and negatives around it, and I feel those very strongly too. It still matters so strongly. Like, even as a 40-something-year-old person, you know, when I see on the screen, you know, there's that Netflix series, Never Have I Ever. And the first time I watched that, and I have the subtitles on because I'm old and I need to see, you know, and also hear, you know, just seeing a brown, long last name on the screen to me was such a joy. I had to pause it and just like take it in. And so, you know, for me as an older person, if that is the feeling that I get, then I can imagine for younger folks that I'm writing for specifically, to see, you know, a Sri Lankan character on the page, which is pretty rare even amongst South Asian literature, is really powerful. And I've got the emails too to prove that that's still really important, just being seen, which is maybe why visibility is a better word for it. But yeah, I definitely concur with that pressure and my resentment about the pressure that I feel as a South Asian writer or a BIPOC writer to somehow fit the culture, whatever the culture is.
Yeah, thank you all so much for those incredible answers. Just a quick thing to mention to our audience, I should have mentioned this earlier, but I want to invite them to throw any questions they have into the Zoom Q&A. There's a little button there, and we'll get to them very soon. But yeah, so I really love this discussion of visibility and like being seen, and all of those, you know, very powerful words and phrases, which makes me want to talk a little bit more about identity. So all of your books are about South Asian individuals in Western countries, South Asians who make up a part of the diaspora in some way or another. This is an identity they share. And I'm curious, what are other identities that you have used your fiction to explore? In other words, how do certain intersectional identities of, for example, gender or sexuality or related identities appear in or influence your fiction? And related to that, how do you think of your identity as authors playing a part in your fiction? And I'd love for Syed to go first on this one.
So, it's funny. I think sometimes when you're writing, you don't always think about how a reader will take it. So one of my favorite questions in an interview, someone said, so I wrote More Than Just a Pretty Face with a protagonist who everyone thinks is quite silly and vain. And he makes a comment about arranged marriage. And the interviewer said, this is what your character said about arranged marriage. Please defend your view. And I'm like, whoa, not my view, his view, the first person narrator. So I think the world you're looking at in a novel as a writer is always through multiple lenses, right? And so you have the narrator, you have your own lens, and then you have the narrator, and then you have the world itself that you've created, which is, I guess, a shadow of the real world. So I think your identity really shapes your lens. And I think probably shapes the character's lens too, if you're authentic in the creation of that character. So it affects the way the character enters the world and interacts with the world. But I like the diaspora. I like writing about first, second, third generations because it sort of plays into the strengths of YA, which is choosing who you're going to become. And there's a lot of power in a diaspora experience of being able to say, this is my culture, but that's my culture too. And I choose this, but I also choose that. And I will create my own identity. I think it lets us do that in a really powerful way. And so I like writing about that in YA fiction.
Yeah, thank you. Sajni, I'd love if you could go next.
I tend to write what I know. So a lot of myself is like a basis for the books I've written so far. And so I kind of use my own identity and feeling like I don't really fit into a box a lot of the times because I felt so othered a lot of my life, and I still do. But I have Southern roots, and so I put that a lot into my writing, which is why all of my books are set in the US and probably in the South. And then I have to focus on the character's identity, like what they are and what they're trying to achieve in the book and what, everything that's going on in their situation, and go on that. And not a lot of times, but I do have some readers that are like, was this really your dad? Or did that really happen to you? I was like, no, it's just a story. I wish people would just see it's just a story. But yes, focusing on the identity of the character as much as possible. But I do see myself in a lot of the main characters that I come up with.
Right, makes sense. Tanya, I'd love to hear your take on this.
Yeah, for me, one of the intersections that I really focus on a lot in my writing, I have two books, both of them have South Asian protagonists, and both are queer protagonists as well. It's a pretty integral part of my own identity, and something that, again, as a teacher, it was maybe even a bigger inspiration for the books that I write than my South Asian identity, because so many of the kids I teach, I see them, finding so much joy in that part of their identity, but then also the opposite. And so when I wrote my first book, Kings, Queens, and In-Betweens, it was kind of a love letter to the drag community, but it was also a love letter to these young kids who are struggling, are figuring things out, who are way ahead of where I was at their age in some ways. And I was really committed to creating a joyful story of queerness in that book. And even in my second book, Bruised, I have another South Asian protagonist, teenage girl who is queer, but again, like that idea of more representations of queerness is really important to me. So, I really do try to make sure that I am not including just a gay character or, just one trans character, and ticking off those boxes. But, what I see, which is like a lot of fluidity, a lot of people questioning or, moving through different stages of their gender and sexuality, that feels really natural and just realistic to me. And so it's something that makes its way into a lot of my writing, all of my writing.
Yeah, I love that. Anuradha, I'd love if you could go next.
Yeah, so I am really interested in sort of this increasingly expansive view of gender identity in South Asian communities. I feel like it's a really exciting time, and I find myself sort of leaning into that in a new story that I'm writing right now. I know in my debut protagonist, Rani is a second generation 18-year-old South Asian woman who wants desperately to fall in love, despite her parents kind of forbidding her to date. And the story explores, kind of interracial forbidden love and sexual awakening, despite sexuality in so many cultures, not spoken about openly. And so there's a Latinx trans character in that novel as well that basically experiences a lot of microaggressions in ways that parallel what Rani herself encounters over the course of the story. I love sort of the nuance involved in, the intersectionality of identity, basically. And in terms of my own identity playing a role, I mean, I feel like there are elements of me in every character that I write, and including the antagonists, actually, my experiences and joys and challenges of being a brown South Asian woman living in the Midwest, along with my roles as a daughter and a mother and friend. They all sort of infuse themselves into my stories. And I feel like fiction is sort of that place where you can work out the complex nature of identity, whether it's your own or your characters, and it's sort of in a state of continual growth and change. And that's one thing that I sort of love about fiction for that purpose.
Right, absolutely. And lastly, Rajani, I'd love your take.
Yeah, so my books are on the younger end of adolescence, right? So a lot of my characters are still dealing with kind of how do they fit within their own families, and how do they navigate friendships? And I guess one of the themes that I'm always thinking about, so I mean, definitely, all of my books are informed by my own experience, but kind of different aspects of my own experience. Sometimes being an immigrant or being a brown person may be an issue in a book, but a lot of times it's not. This is just a person who happens to be South Asian who is just living their lives and having their own adventures. I am very interested in kind of what it is to be a child of immigrants, and what do those characters feel they owe their parents, or what kind of relationships do they have with their parents? And it's really interesting because in a country where we're used to teenage rebellion, at least from my experience, that can take a very different, like it is expressed in a different way, at least in my life. It's a lot more kind of like sneaky sometimes, rather than just yelling at people. So, I mean, it's interesting, but it's still a form of rebellion. It's still a form of testing boundaries. In one of my books, I kind of have characters actually talk about what it's like to be first generation versus second generation, and how parents who were born and raised in this country may feel differently from parents who were immigrants, and how the experience of those children are different. And then I also want to just say that, like, I'm from South India, so there's like a lot of South Indian rep in my books, which is, for me, it was like just really fun just to like put it out there, because it's not necessarily something that you see very often in South Asian literature. And then finally, the whole issue of mental health. So my next book, which is coming out next year, kind of addresses mental health and kind of people's reluctance to even admit to it, even though it's clearly a big part of what is going on in their lives, and how it can be hard for any community, but I think it's also particularly hard for immigrant communities to kind of talk about this and get the help that they need.
Yeah, wow. Thank you all for those answers. Those were very powerful, very nuanced conceptions of identity. And I'm interested in a lot of what you guys have been saying about the expansiveness of identity formation. And I'm curious about like other signifiers of identity or other things that influence one's identity. And I want to talk a little bit about setting when it comes to your books. So the settings of many of the novels that you all have written are very relevant to your characters' upbringing and self-conception. So I'm curious how you chose some of your settings and what the idea of place in general and being mean to you as creators and to your protagonists. And I'd love to start off with Sajni.
My debut novel, The Knockout, is set in Austin, Texas, because that's where I grew up. So it's like she's at that school, the school that I went to, the colors, the school colors, the mascot, everything. Some of her language is like very Southern. What the food that she eats is very Southern, and it's like little. It's like little, what do you call those? Easter eggs, I guess that's the term. Like little details that I hear and there, but it's not her entire world. It's just, this is where she is. This is where she grew up. And in my latest book, my main characters are in Atlanta, just because I didn't want to be in Austin. Like if I could write every book in Austin, Texas, it would always be in Austin, Texas. But as I say that, my next book does go back to Austin. So I'm not very creative when it comes to that. Coming up with a different area, mainly because I have to do extra research, and I feel like I don't have time for that. I just throw them a place that I know and just let them have their story.
Yeah, I love that answer. Anuradha, I'd love your take on this.
Yeah, I tend to gravitate towards stories where the setting is so evocative that it serves as almost like a kind of character in the story, one that is to be engaged with and even defined by. I just love those kinds of stories where the setting provides that sense of kind of grounding and or even tension within the plot lines. So like for my debut, I chose Evanston, Illinois, which was very much a love letter to my hometown as well. It is a suburb that's just north of Chicago, and it's known for sort of its natural beauty. It's right on Lake Michigan. There's, Northwestern University's campus is there. There's a lot of diversity and liberalism, and it's home to a really large public high school, which is my high school of like 4,000 kids. And I just found it a really interesting place to set the story, mainly because kind of like what Sajni was saying, it was like, there's so much that you're sort of making up when you're writing fiction that it's nice to have something that you don't have to make up. Like, it's like, okay, I remember what that scene looks like. I'm just going to write it down. But I felt like the overall ethos in this town, which is, I've actually moved back to Evanston really recently, my hometown. So the overall ethos here is that sort of, there's a sense that we are kind of above, bias or racism or microaggressions because it's so diverse and it's so huge and it's right by a big city. And the reality is that those tensions can and do exist in, culturally diverse environments, of course, and how one might maybe not notice those red flags. I think that happens more often because you don't see it coming. And when things like that happen, it's kind of even more of a shock because there's a sense of liberalism and openness, and people who are so different all around you, living together, working together. I thought that was sort of an interesting tension to include in the story, and also that sense of authenticity. I just knew what it was like being a teen in Evanston, so that part was it was just nice, like what Sajni was saying. And I sort of feel like both Ronnie, my character, and I sort of have this complicated love for Evanston, Chicago, and the Midwest, which parallels sort of both the like highs and lows that the character experiences, with relation to her family and her first love and sort of the tensions there. So both are sort of filled with beauty, but there's also painful challenges that we all face, which I felt like the setting kind of was a perfect place for all that to happen.
Absolutely. Yeah. Rajani, I'd love if you could go next.
Yeah, so a couple of my novels are set in an imaginary version of the town of Massachusetts where I live, which is fun. Only magical stuff happens there, which is great. But Red, White, and Whole is set not only in a small Midwestern city that is supposed to be like Louisville, Kentucky, which is where I grew up, but it's also set in the 80s. And I did that on purpose because I wanted to have this character be the child of immigrants in the 80s in a smaller place, right? That was not hugely diverse. And because it was different then, right? With no internet, no WhatsApp, no cell phones, like it was like that. Because I grew up during that time, and it felt like sometimes that my relatives were on another planet, not just another country, because it took so long to see them. And a phone call was super expensive, and we literally wrote letters on those aerogram, the aerogram mail, because it was cheaper. Like they were so paper thin you could like see through them, right? But like they got there, I don't know if they got there faster, but it was a lot cheaper. And when I talked to kids about this, I was like, there was no way to like Zoom with anybody. And they look at me like, wait, what? And then you add in the musical component, which, I mean, the culture of the 80s is a huge part of Red, White, and Whole. And like how Reha, the main character, feels that music is the thing that, is in common. She has in common with everybody, right? Her Indian friends, even her parents, and her white friends at school, like everyone is listening to the same music, because honestly, we didn't have that many choices at that time. But she feels like those lyrics really speak to her. And so I feel like that culture also pervades the story and was important in terms of setting. And of course, that Red, White, and Whole is probably the closest in terms of my own experience of any of my books. And so that was really fun. And it was really also interesting, and it was heartbreaking at times to think about how I felt at that time, and how this desire to belong somewhere and wondering if there was any place on the planet where I actually belonged, that was palpable at that time. And because didn't always feel like I was American enough, I definitely didn't always feel like I was Indian enough. And when I went to India, I was like, for sure not Indian enough, because everyone clearly knew that I was not from there. So yeah, I wanted to put all of those things, and I think the setting really contributed to that in the story.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Tanya, I'd love to hear your take on this.
Yeah, I was thinking about this earlier and thinking that I'm not sure how much this question applies to my books, only because both books that I've written so far are definitely in my mind in the Pacific Northwest. I don't name Vancouver or any specific city, partly because I wanted the freedom to sort of create and not have to stick to any particular aspect of a city. But I did certainly in my first book want to zoom in on like a small town setting, mainly because it was really important that this young person who was young and kind of naive and hadn't been exposed to a lot, felt like she needed to expand her world a little bit more. And so that's reflected in where she's from and then where she goes, which is really not that far, but it's quite different to where she lives. And that actually sense of setting, small town setting, for me actually came from one of my favorite books of all time, which is Fried Green Tomatoes. I don't know that anybody's read it, but it's, it came out in the 80s, Fanny Flagg. It's one of my favorite books. It's like such a, it's set in the South, which is not, far from where I live, but there's such a sense of comfort in that book for me. And that was the feeling that I wanted for this book too. And so in that way, setting became really important, because while the small town setting was a barrier in some ways, it also is a sense of home to her, right? It's a sense of of belonging in other ways. So it's that complicated sense that I think we have with the places where we're from, where, you know, even me growing up in not a tiny town, you know, Victoria, BC is a decent sized city, but it felt small because I needed more. I needed to be exposed to more. I needed to feel more as a young person, and got that by just, you know, going a little bit further away. And so, you know, maybe that's sort of reflected also in that first book. But otherwise, I really just want to, with my settings, I really just sort of look at it almost more like a practical sense at this stage. I can see myself going away from that because I love really evocative settings. But for now, that's where I've stayed.
Absolutely, yeah. And Syed, I'd love your thoughts on this.
Well, I'm local, so I've written a lot about, you know, California, and not, I said one novel in Sacramento, but that's like setting it anywhere, it doesn't matter. It's like it could be any town in the U.S. But I've written a lot about San Francisco because I think San Francisco is fascinating. You know, it's diverse and accepting, but also very elitist, and at the same time very exclusive and expensive. But there's all this poverty. It's a fascinating place, and what I've found sort of really works well for San Francisco and me is to have my characters talk about the city based on where they are in their journey. And sometimes their perceptions of the place they're in changes based on their development. And that's always, to me, the most interesting part about any setting is how the character's relationship with the setting changes. And so in Pretty Face, you know, the major epiphany the character he has while he's walking around San Francisco, and he realizes, God, this place is beautiful, but God, it's fake. And so he, you know, he makes that breakthrough, and the city is directly involved in that. So I think I'm fortunate to have been around a city like that, and I've always enjoyed writing about it.
Yeah, thank you all so much for those answers. Those are very, very interesting. And I love how all of your novel settings have been somewhat informed by what you know, you're drawing on like your own experience in your own lives. And I'm curious as to how you interact with others who also know the same things, namely your audience. And I know we've been dancing around this topic a little bit, but I'd love to get a little bit specific about who exactly you imagine as your audience. Like, who are you speaking to, and who, if anyone, are you speaking for? And I'd love to start with Tanya for this one.
I often imagine my students, it just is a natural fit. You know, I have them in mind. Often I teach high school, and I am really surrounded by a lot of smart people. You know, they give me a run for my money constantly. And so that definitely informs my sense of not taking my audience for granted, or, you know, setting my expectations high too, because they meet them. They meet those expectations. They're really smart. They're really informed. A lot of them, yes, they're, you know, teenagers, and so there's naivety, and there's, you know, there's that youth, of course, that youthfulness, but in a lot of ways, they are further along than most of the adults I know when it comes to issues of race and sexuality and gender. And so I definitely really respect them. I respect the audience I'm writing for, because I'm writing for really intelligent people in my mind, and people who are really complex, and who understand complexity and understand nuance, and can read between the lines. I'm also writing for young people who, as I mentioned before, who even when they are, you know, super intelligent and very talented and outgoing, have those really soft spots and major vulnerabilities and insecurities. And so there's this balance for me of writing for folks who are really, really clued in and smart, and then also people who at the very same time need to be held with a certain amount of care, I think, as adults writing for young people. So it's a balance. It's a tricky balance, I think, as I'm sure many of the panelists know, but it's one that I'm constantly thinking about.
Right, absolutely. And just really quick, this is my second to last question. So to our audience, please throw your questions into our Q&A function. And yeah, and now about audience, I'd love to hear from Rajani.
So first of all, I write for myself. I mean, like really, honestly, that's the truth. If I'm not interested in it, I can't write about it. So I write to entertain myself, to work things out in my own brain. And I write, I mean, for young people, for all young people, especially for young people who are South Asian, because I want them to be able to see themselves in books, but also for any young people who want to read. And what I will say is that the wonderful thing about writing for young people is that they recognize BS. So we can't do that, right? Like we have to, I say that even though I'm writing fiction, that we write it to tell the truth. And the kinds of truth I'm talking about are emotional truths. So my goal is to create characters that feel real enough, that feel specific and real, so that their experiences feel like real experiences to young readers. And you know what? Maybe not so young readers. I think a lot of adults, a lot more adults than we think, than we might think, read books for young people. So yeah, that's who I write for. But first of all, it has to be for me.
Absolutely, yeah. Anuradha, I'd love to hear your take on this.
Yeah, I mean, writing that first draft, like Rajani is saying, I mean, that's always for myself, you know, first and foremost. I write to help myself understand what I'm feeling or thinking, or what I observe or what I fear. You know, often these include various, you know, issues of identity and intersectionality, like we've talked about, or like that shape shifting notion that we all have of culture, the ways we embrace, but also sort of like chafe against, you know, societal or parental expectations. It's during the revision process, I think, is when I start to begin to think deeply about a wider audience. Okay, like this is now for other people to read, not just for myself. So I start to think about, you know, young adults navigating identity and, you know, what their perceptions of race or class or expectations. I talk to people. You know, it's basically just sort of part of the research process. And then, of course, you're also writing for adults. You know, like Rajani said, it's a lot of adults are reading YA, and I don't necessarily think about the adults that I'm writing for. I first and foremost think about kids when I'm doing that, you know, revision or rewriting process. But many do discover through their reading a deeper understanding for their own past experiences. There's a nostalgia to reading, you know, YA, and there's that sense of like that ever-changing identity that we all are going through. Our identities are constantly shifting and changing and growing. I had a wonderful book club meeting they were called the Lake Bluff Greats, and they were retired teachers from the school that I taught at. They were in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, and they read American Betia, and the conversation really blew me away. I mean, they had all kinds of course, I mean, they were older and they had all these amazing experiences, and we were able to sort of talk about our own, you know, past experiences with love and identity. So yeah, I do think that really resonates with me, that idea that, you know, you don't know who's going to be reading this and who's going to be able to connect with it. And so you want to be writing from your own truth first, and then you think about sort of, you know, the masses reading it later. And in terms of who I'm speaking for, I would say that inherently, you know, writing is like a political act. You know, it's an act of sort of trying to imbue your stories with, you know, elements of yourself, elements of your fight. And so through my writing, I offer a voice for anyone who's ever sort of been desperate to hold on to themselves, or their culture in the face of, you know, that sense of invisibility or microaggressions or prejudice, especially when they appear, you know, within those like very close relationships. It's very confusing. So I guess I offer solidarity, you know, in my writing. That's what I hope to do anyway, for those who have sort of had to fight for that culture or sense of self, in love or in friendships. For those kinds of experiences are kind of more commonplace than I think we necessarily, you know, or at least that more common than I thought, you know, especially when I was doing my research for that first book. So I guess I hope that the writing sort of sparks conversation. You know, I love that sort of like James Baldwin always talks about how, or one of my favorite quotes of his was, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." So I try to think about that when I am writing sort of those difficult, on those difficult topics.
Yeah, thank you for that. Syed, I'd love to hear your opinion on this.
So this is going to sound weird, because it's always weird to lift the curtain and let people into the room where the writing happens. Especially for someone like me who doesn't really plot things out and plan things out. I find that I have to be in service to the characters first and foremost. It's almost as if this character in my head, which I realize is not real, has trusted me with the story, and it's their story that I'm in service to. And what I find is if I start trying to put messages in there or try to steer the character certain ways, they stop talking to me, and then bad things happen, and I get stuck, and I gotta start all over again. And so what I found is my first service is to the characters and the story, their story that I'm telling. And so it's nice when themes arise and messages arise, often in revision from those stories that I can hone in on. And then I can start thinking about the audience, assuming there's going to be an audience is always a little, little frightening. But I think the first fidelity of a writer is to the characters, at least in my circumstance, because otherwise they stop talking to me, and there's no writing that gets done afterwards. So.
Yeah. And finally, Sajni, I'd love to hear your take on this.
I also write because of the story comes first, and the story is inside of me. I have to get it out. Like, there's no way around it. It drives me up the wall. It's a pressure that builds up, and I have to get the story out. And I learned later on, because for a while I stopped writing because I wasn't getting anywhere with publishing and agents and all that stuff. I stopped writing for a while, and it led to depression. And I realized that writing is my outlet and my therapy. So I have to also write for my own sanity, for my own mental health. It really helps me in that way, in a very, very deep way. And when I write stories, it's just for the entertainment purpose. Like, I want everyone to be able to read the story. I don't want someone to ever pick up my book and say, well, this is about an Indian girl. There's no way I can relate. Or this is an issue book or whatever. I can't relate. So I just want everyone to be able to read the book and not see it for just one thing or the other thing. But yes, first and foremost, it is because I need to get the story out, and it is my therapy. And then I hope in the end that anyone can pick it up and anyone can enjoy it.
Yeah, wow. Those were really beautiful, profound answers that have given me a lot to think about. And I'm curious what all of you are thinking about right now in terms of what more do you want to see in the world of South Asian YA, or in the world of South Asian fiction in general? And what's next for you? This is my last question. So let's start off with Anuradha and go from there.
Oh, I loved this question. I would say that more South Asian diasporic retellings of classics. I would love that. I would love South Asian, maybe psychological thrillers and mysteries, stories that sort of delve deep into kind of that like dark psyche of its characters. I love stories like that. I love also just reading about real love in all its ups and downs. And I mean, I love rom-coms. I could never write well, I shouldn't say I could never. I hope one day to be able to write a rom-com, but so far it hasn't happened yet. And, but I love sort of this idea of not just romantic love, but also love and friendship and family between siblings. And so basically stories that are kind of honest about, the ups and downs of love. And in terms of what's next, is that a question that you also asked? What's next on our?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm working on something new that I can't yet share about, but it's stretching me creatively and in ways that feel really exciting, and kind of blending a couple of different genres together. So it's been really fun.
Amazing. Thank you. Sajni, I'd love your take on this.
Sorry, I forgot the question. I had an answer ready and I totally forgot. I'm sorry, could you repeat?
No, not a problem. I'm just asking, what more do you want to see in the world of South Asian YA and South Asian fiction in general, and also what's next for you?
Okay. I want to see just more of everything from South Asian writers because there's so many genres and so many age groups to cover. And I'm seeing a lot of it now, a lot more than what we have seen in the past couple of decades, definitely. But I want to be able to just walk into a bookstore and see like a bunch of South Asian names and not think, oh my God, wow, that's awesome that there's a South Asian writer here, one among hundreds. I just want to see more, and for it to be more common, for it to not feel like we're still othered and rare because we're not rare. And there's so many talented writers from the South Asian background and so many stories that we can all tell. So just more of everything. And then what do I have next? I have 5 books coming out. I have a rom-com coming out next February. That is in Austin. It's a comedic hijinks running around trying to find a celebrity professor that actually did teach at UT. My next YA comes out next year in October, and that is about 2 friends who have fallen apart and have to come together during Diwali in Dubai because their families are best friends and they have to go over there together with their vacation. And in addition to that, I have another rom-com, and which I haven't figured out what it's going to be about yet. And I have moving into dark fantasy. So I have a really, really dark fantasy that's not lovey-dovey, the stuff that I usually write. So I'm excited about that one. I can't say anything about that one because it's not announced yet.
Amazing. Rajani, I'd love to hear about this from you.
Yes, I'm just going to echo what was said. I want to see all kinds of stories from South Asian writers and creators. I want to see books. I want to see movies. I want to see TV shows and series. Like, just bring it on. Come on. There are a lot of us. Like, and also like it's for everybody. So like everyone needs to see more of us because we have so many stories to tell. In terms of myself, so I have 5 books coming next year. I have a novel, another novel in verse, dual POV. I have 4 picture books coming out, 2 nonfiction and 2 fiction, which I'm really excited about, and many, many more books in the works. The story that I'm working on after this is a fantasy, which is going to be like a full fantasy, not a contemporary fantasy. So I'm so thrilled about that. And so, I write about adolescence, and like most of my books are categorized as middle grade, right? But I do have some YA stories, true YA stories, according to American Publishing, that are going to come out. So I'm very excited about that too. So yeah, but like, bring me all the South Asian books.
Sounds amazing. Syed, I'd love to hear about this from you.
So I think I agree with everyone, and the more voices, the better. That goes back to the conversation we were having about representation too. It's a problem that will solve itself as there are more voices. But what I would like to see though is more of a acknowledgement and promotion of the genius of our own canon, right? And an insistence that the Western canon expand to become a more global canon, because we have brilliant authors. I mean, obviously Wilde and Austen and Shaw and all these great names that are universal and are taught everywhere. Because of colonialism. But we have our own tradition and we have absolute geniuses. And every time someone talks about Shakespeare, I want to Hatem Ghalib, and so there's a conversation to be had there. And I think writing characters who appreciate, or at least having characters in books who appreciate our own tradition will be important, and it's something we can do in service of broadening the canon. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And last but not least, Tanya.
Yeah, just more and more different kinds of South Asian too, just a wider variety perhaps of origins and narratives. What I have so nothing specific, I just want more. And in terms of what I have on the go, I'm working on 2 projects right now. One which it's undecided whether it's YA or a crossover, but slightly older protagonist dives back into the drag world, because I just felt like there was just so much more to be on offer there. Not tied to my first book though. That one is really fun because it's dual perspective, which I've never done before. Really immersed in a pretty local scene where, you know, in Vancouver has this incredible drag scene that is so just boundary pushing and also traditional, and just has all these different sides to it, much more than we see on RuPaul, that I really want more people to know about. And then the other book is a YA book, which definitely pulls on my own experiences as a teacher, teaching right across the street from a Catholic high school. And I was born and raised Catholic as well. And so I've wanted to dive into that experience with, you know, the positive and the negatives, and thinking a lot about that intersection of queerness and religion, and, you know, and my childhood, and just so many things are coming up in writing this book, which have been so powerful for me to revisit and think about, and then thinking about how it applies to for young people today, and the kids I see who are trying to figure out how to make those things work in their lives. So that one involves like an underground gender and sexuality alliance, which is kind of exciting and something I've been thinking about a lot over the years. So it's been really fun to write that one.
Amazing. Wow, I'm so impressed by all of you, and I completely agree. More. That's what we need. Thank you all so much for your incredible answers. And now we'll move on to some questions from our audience. There's a few, so if you have any more questions to our audience, please throw them in. We'll get to as many as we can. And I'll also try to condense a few that are similar. So let's start off with a couple of people have questions about like publishing and that kind of industry. So let's see, some people are asking, how did you guys start a career in writing? And also, given the horror stories about the difficulties of the publishing world, how would you recommend approaching the process? Another person has a similar question about what are your struggles with the publishing world? Did you have to fight any South Asian cliches or stereotypes? So let's just start off. I'll go in order again, maybe with Sajni this time.
Which one am I answering? A little bit of all.
A little bit of all of them, publishing, writing, yeah.
I would say, as far as how to approach publishing, approach it like any other business venture. You want to do your research. You want to make sure that if you're going the agent route, that you have researched the right agents, know how their clients react to them, their relationships, same with publishers and authors. And yes, I do have horror stories. They're not actually that bad. In comparison to what something other things that I've heard. When I was first trying to get published, which was many years ago, there was always the rejection that said my books were too niche, like, you know, basically too brown. They didn't know how to market it. There's no way you can market a rom-com with the Indian MC the way you do with every other rom-com, right? Those things have, for the most part, have faded away. So hopefully this is not something that you should come up with now. If it is, then red flag, don't ever submit to them again. I have had an established publisher tell me that I should whitewash, you know, one of my characters. And so these things will happen. There'll be things that you don't agree with. I would say, know your worth and be professional, but also stand your grounds, because even if you're new, it doesn't mean that you have to cave and bend to everyone, and have a strong support system, including your agent if you go the agent route.
Yeah, thank you for that. Tanya, I wonder if you have any takes on this.
I have to say my experience in publishing has been good, has been really positive, mainly because both my agent and my editor are, I would say, culturally aware and really supportive. And I didn't come up against, you know, questions around too much brownness. In fact, you know, that was really cultivated and encouraged. to whatever extent I wanted it to be. It was also not expected either. So that was a nice sense of freedom, I think. I mean, I don't know that I can add much to what Sajni said. Those are really great answers. But I would echo that piece around knowing why you're writing, being really clear about what's important to you, what you're willing to, maneuver around, but what you're not willing to give up. And because, the payoff might be that you get a book deal or something like that, but then what might be lost is, how you feel about the work that you're putting out into the world, which I think is a pretty big loss. So, that sense of the why of your own writing, I think is really important, whatever route you go into with publishing or getting your book into the world.
Yeah, absolutely. Anuradha, do you have any takes on this?
Yeah, I mean, you guys have given really great answers. I do remember getting involved with Publishers Marketplace. This is just a very nitty gritty thing that really helped in terms of sort of what Sajni was saying about the research. If you get on there, I think it's like a $25 per month subscription, and you don't need to have the subscription for too many months, hopefully, if you end up finding your agent that way. But it is a really great resource to look into. And then I would just say, get on when you're looking for an agent, just make sure you're doing the MSWL on Twitter. I don't know if that's still a thing. It was when I was looking for an agent, but that really helped to see, what are the kinds of things that editors and publishers are looking for right now. And that kind of helps you find your match. And then the other thing I would say is, I think just being really clear of what you're willing to compromise on. And then the final thing I was going to mention is just to kind of look out there, find out, are there any awards or anything that you can that will help you stand out? These are things that you sort of think, okay, what are the chances, but you never know. And, I just needed a deadline. Honestly, I'd been working on American Beauty for I don't even know how many, at least 12 years. And it was just okay, I need to send it somewhere and just not fiddle anymore. And it ended up winning this award. And it really helped from the standpoint of just getting your name out there, being able to put in the first line of your query letter that you won an award, that you stood out in this way. Just sort of having that attitude, why not me? I think that's a really hard one when you're competing against so many people, but taking your time, making sure it's your best work and putting it out there.
Yeah, thank you for that. Syed, do you have anything to add to this discussion?
Well, I think ultimately, when you are ready, take your shot. You never really know. The book that I got my agent off of, The Bad Muslim Discount, I had no real hope that it would be published. But I just happened to finish it 3 days before this contest that used to exist called Pitch Wars, that Rajani is familiar with. It was rough. It was my first draft. I hadn't really even edited it. But I was like, what, I'm not going to get picked anyway, so I'm just going to submit this thing. And I ended up getting picked for Pitch Wars, and it turns out there was this big deal. I didn't even know it's a big deal. I'm in, and now all of a sudden, my career takes off. So don't do that. Don't submit your first drafts. That'd be bad. But at some point, you have to sort of. I found, at least for me, there's this tendency to fiddle and fiddle and fiddle because it's never perfect, but it's never going to be perfect. So take your shot. When you do take your shot, think about what other projects the agents, if you're going that route, the agent represents, what kind of people they represent, but also what kind of books they do. I mean, I hear agents complain about, I don't do sci-fi and people are sending me sci-fi. Don't do that. You're wasting their time. You're wasting your own time. So basic research, like everyone said. And other than that, you just have to have hope and groundless confidence, and then the rest of it takes care of itself. So.
Yeah. And finally, Rajani, do you have anything to add to this?
Yes. So I would say, first of all, read widely, read a lot, and read things that are current. You don't want to just rely on the things that you used to love when you were a kid. You want to read current things to see kind of what contemporary fiction looks like, and write a lot. And, I think that it's easy sometimes to do lots of writing adjacent things, but like actually write. And everyone's first draft is awful. Like, that's fine. So like when at least when I'm drafting, I'm just like, I have to put away the inner editor and just say, I'm going to write this thing and it's going to be terrible. And then I will fix it later. And then I would also say, I'm not going to repeat all the wonderful advice everyone has given about doing your research and like picking the right agent. It is absolutely better to find the right agent rather than to take any agent, because some of them are not the right fit and that's not what you want. But the other thing I would say is don't be afraid to be vulnerable. Like when you put real emotion on the page, I think that readers sense that. So it's scary, but if you want to do it or you feel like that's what the story calls for, then go for it.
Yeah, wow. Thank you guys. That's all really practical and also really profound advice. I appreciate it. Since it's almost 7:30, this is probably going to be our last question of the evening. But some of our audience has questions about like what you guys like to read and any book recs you might have, like any particular works or genres you find interesting or inspiring, especially nonfiction, if that's something that you guys read at all. So maybe we can just start with Rajani and go from there.
Oh, I'm reading so many things at one time. Like it's so funny because I read a lot of the age group that I write for, but not when I'm drafting it, because I just don't want to have other people's voices that are like in my head. So now that I'm drafting again, I'm reading a lot of adult fiction because I'm not writing adult fiction, and I'm reading like everything from like thrillers and suspense to rom-coms, and rom-coms were like huge for me during the pandemic, because I was like, I just need to know that everything's going to be okay in a story, and I don't want to like freak out too much. But on the other hand, I'm also reading like thrillers / ghost story stuff. So that's what I'm reading right now. I just stuff that gets me away from the thing that I'm writing.
Yeah, I love that answer. Anuradha, do you have anything you're reading right now you want to share?
I do. I am reading, well, I just finished something, story called Build Your House Around My Body. It was a Gothic suspense. It was fantastic. It's by Violet Cooper-Smith, and it really blew me away. I loved it. The language was incredible. So, and like Rajani said, I like to read outside of the genre in which I'm writing. So for the same reason. So that was one that I kind of moved into and fell in love with. Another that I'm reading right now it's actually an arc of an upcoming YA contemporary called This Place Is Still Beautiful by Cece Tian. And that's coming out June 7th. So I'm really excited to be reading that ahead of time. And gosh, there was another one that, woman, it's right here. I'm like let's see, A Cloud in the Shape of a Girl by Jean Thompson. Jean Thompson is one of those authors who I've read her short stories many, many years ago. And I loved them so much that I decided to write my own short story. And that was what ended up being American Betia, fleshed out into a novel down the line. So this is one of those authors that's like a comfort food. And so this is one of her most recent ones.
Amazing. Syed, do you want to share any recs or books you're reading right now?
Sure. So I'm a little bit different in the sense that I actually stop reading entirely when I'm drafting, because any voices will mess with my head. But because I jump from genre to genre and age group to age group, I go through like an intense reading period where I'll read like everything I get my hands on for that genre. So I was working on like a thriller, and so I read a lot of thrillers, a lot of like Jack Reacher and stuff. And now I'm trying to switch back to adult fiction. So Gentleman in Moscow by M.R. Towles, who's brilliant. I'm reading Station 11. For nonfiction, I actually really recommend for writers to read nonfiction, fiction writers to read nonfiction, because you never know. I read this book called Churchill's Secret War, which became the basis for More Than Just a Pretty Face. If you want to know about the Bengal famine and the history behind that, you never know where you're going to get your ideas and inspiration from. I recommend you read poetry. I'm usually reading someone. I'm reading Fez. I'm with Fez right now, but there's poetry helps sort of, it's just the expressions and the language really help me when I'm writing literary stuff. So that's what I've read recently. And yeah, like Rajani said, read widely, because you know, you never know what contemporary is going to speak to you. And also agents are going to want to know what your book is like. And if you can only name books from 50 years ago, that's going to be a problem. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Tanya, I'd love to hear what you have to add to this.
Well, it's funny because I actually read a lot of YA always, like whenever I always have a YA book on the go. I find it really helpful and inspiring. It kind of gives me ideas, or just sort of makes me think about different ways of going about my own story. So I actually let it sort of influence me, I guess, a bit more. And in terms of a couple of book recs, I mean, right now I'm actually just rereading Zami, New Spelling of My Name by Audre Lorde, who, along with, you know, Toni Morrison and Bell Hooks, are my like trifecta of perfection always. And I'm rereading it because I remember it being so formative for me in my 20s, and one of those first books that just opened up the world of literature for me, having only read, you know, the usual suspects in high school and before. And one of the questions was around memoir or nonfiction by South Asians, and just the first one that came to mind. She's a Canadian author, Vivek Shreya, who I don't know whether you have heard of, but she writes everything from nonfiction to fiction to children's books. She's amazing, such a you know, beautiful soul, and so smart, and a lot of like pop culture stuff, and just really wide ranging topics. And she writes a memoir nonfiction book called I'm Afraid of Men, and it's just sort of her relationship to being a transgender woman who you know, is trying to find her place in the world, and how, you know, misogyny and the patriarchy has really impacted her. So, you know, her work and the work of some other South Asian authors in terms of just hearing their stories, their real life stories, are certainly things that feed into my understanding of what we've been talking about, which is this huge, wide range of South Asian experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And last but not least, Sajni.
I went on a binge of just nonfiction, mainly mythology and celebrity autobiographies for some reason on audiobook. I just went through so many of them. And I gravitate, as far as fiction goes, I gravitate toward science fiction and horror. So Mexican Gothic, I think, was one of the ones that I always recommend. And I recommend it on an audiobook at night with the lights off, because it's so creepy. So yeah, that's my main rec.
Amazing. Wow. Thank you guys so much. What an incredible discussion we've just had. I think I've learned so much, and honestly have even more questions now than I did before. But in the interest of time, I'll have to end our event here. I'm really sorry we can't get to all the questions that were asked by the audience, but thank you all so much for attending our event, and a huge thank you to our panelists for being amazing and profound and intelligent and everything good. Yeah, have a wonderful evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Guys.
Good night.